Kind of here today to talk about the NAR settlement and where we're at right now with the new documents that are out and have been released by Florida Realtors, where we're at just in general. And then we'll talk about what we are doing at Impact Realty to make it smooth and seamless for you guys going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and talk about some key dates here. All right, so effective August 17th is when the settlement officially goes into effect. However, our MLS, Stellar MLS, has said that as of August 6th, which is 5 days from now, as of August 6th, they are removing the compensation fields from the MLS. So really, for our purposes, let's just be ready to go on August 6th. That's the mandate that I've got to our office staff, and everything that we are putting in place for you guys will be ready to go on August 6th, even though even some of the forms that have that Florida Realtors has said they're going to get out to us haven't even gotten out to us. In fact, some of these forms that I'm going over today just got released, I think, 2 days ago. So we are right on top of everything that's coming out, and we're rolling it out to you as fast as possible, but in a way that that makes a lot of sense. So August 6th is when the the compensation fields are going to be removed, and there have been a set of forms released by Florida Realtors. There are still some yet to come, and we are in the process at Impact Realty of implementing various tools for you guys, some of which you already have, i.e. .loop, which we'll talk about that in a little while, but some of which are going to be new regarding the compensation communication to co-broke agents and other brokerages. We're in process with it right now. We are testing it, and I'm going to go over how that's going to affect you guys and the importance of getting documentation in that you guys are going to have to get in. So we're going to start off with the forms that are being that have been released. Okay, so far there have been listing agreements released, all the various types of listing agreements, so single agent, transaction broker, no brokerage, and all that. We're going to go over the transaction brokerage listing agreement that's been released. There have been compensation forms that have been released, which are effectively the seller to buyer's broker compensation form, and us, the seller's broker to buyer's broker compensation forms. We did go over those at the sales meeting, but I'm going to go over those again. There are buyer broker agreements that have been released, and then there are showing agreements that have been released, which are slightly different than what's been existent in the past, and we'll go over those here in a little bit. So, all right, so without further ado, let me get into the exclusive buyer broker agreement, which has been released now. I think this was released 2 days ago by Florida Realtors. Now, if you guys want to check out what has been released, if you just go to floridarealtors.org and there's a NAR settlement page here, you can see exactly what has been released. And like you said, on July 30th, so 2 days ago, we've had a couple of forms released and updated here. But you can see all the different forms. Which ones we're going to go over today are going to be the transaction broker listing agreement, which is ERS 20TB. This one right here. And then we're going to go over the compensation agreements, seller to buyer's broker, CASB1, seller's broker to buyer's broker, CABB1, and then exclusive buyer broker agreement for a transaction broker. We're going to go over that one. And then we'll go over the showing agreements, the pre-touring agreements, and the showing agreement. Okay, so that's what we're going to go over today. Now, overall, my thoughts on this are I want you guys to think of this as an opportunity. And the reason why I want you to think of it as an opportunity is historically the way things have been done, when you are a buyer's agent, and you have not gotten a buyer broker agreement signed already by your client, you're somewhat at the mercy of the listing agent and what they're offering you as a co-broker agreement. So if they're offering you just 2% on the MLS or 2.5% or 1.5% or whatever is listed on the MLS, unless you've gotten a different agreement signed by a buyer agency agreement, that's what you're getting. And now you guys get to take control of the compensation that you make. And remember that the settlement agreement states that whatever you put in your buyer broker agreement, which must be signed, or I'm sorry, a written agreement must be signed prior to you touring homes, whatever you put in that is the maximum you can make. So you want that number as high as possible. Now, we're going to discuss once we get to that document strategies for you guys to and how you can have those conversations with your buyers. But you want that number as high as possible because you don't want to put 2% in there and then your listing agreement offer or your seller offers 3%, and then all of a sudden you just shortchange yourself. So it's an opportunity for you guys to actually take control of your commissions and make more money. All right. And with that said, we are having to make decisions as a brokerage to not to comply with the settlement agreement and also to protect you guys and benefit you guys. So as things are adjusting slightly, it's not even a huge shift in the industry. This is not when we start going through these agreements, you're going to realize that these are just slight modifications to the agreements, and it's not the massive shift that's being sensationalized all over the place. So just take it as an opportunity for you guys to take control of your commissions, make more money, and be further protected, because this actually does further protect you guys and us as a brokerage from potential litigation. So we're going to go over some things that we are going to be modifying within your independent contractor agreement, which helps put more money in your pocket and protect you guys and give you some control that you've always had, but it kind of memorializes that. So at the sales meeting, I'm going to be going over changes to your independent contractor agreement, all of them that we're going to be implementing. But just know that we're doing everything to protect you and benefit you. And you'll see some of these today. But back to this, the FloridaRealtors.org. You can find everything on here. You can find some of the videos here from the Florida Realtors General Counsel, Joanna Watkins. We're going to actually watch one of the videos today. I played one of them at the last sales meeting. We played this one down here at the last sales meeting that talks about new compensation agreements, but we're gonna play one of these. And she actually has a very good question and answer video on this website. We're not going to play that one because it's 56 minutes long, but she has it's very good. I'm actually going to take a snippet from it a little bit. But all right, we'll start off with the exclusive buyer brokerage. The exclusive brokerage listing agreement. This is the transaction broker listing agreement that we're going to go over today. On that Florida Realtors page, there are redlined versions that are marked up versions of changes to the previous document. So the changes from what was existing before to what is now out there is what I'm going to go over today. At the last sales meeting, they didn't release the marked up version, so I had to go over with you guys exactly what had changed and what I had noticed had changed. And you'll see that in here as well, but this makes it a lot easier and clearer for us to go over today. So just really simply, they added the language brokerage here. But starting to get into the document that talks about concessions. If you guys recall, although the compensation field is being removed from the MLS is adding a field for seller concessions. So what is the seller willing to pay? They're willing to pay mortgage discount points or other closing costs or concessions not to exceed a certain amount that's put in the listing agreement. All right. Now, this is very important because it came up with one of our agents recently about mortgage discount points. Is that considered a seller concession? Well, it was previously already in the listing agreement and specifically states that can be included as a seller concession. So whatever amount that the seller is willing to give as a seller concession, which includes buy down of buyer interest rates, unless you guys strike through that in your listing agreement, that's going to be a field in the MLS. With that said, it cannot be specified for buyer compensation. They can use it for buyer compensation, but it cannot be buyer agent compensation but it cannot be specific to buyer agent compensation. So that's part of the NAR settlement. And it's now a field that includes the concessions that's going to be added in the MLS. So make sure that if your seller is going to be offering seller concessions to a buyer, you're putting that amount in there so we can populate it into the MLS. All right. Or I'm sorry. Yes. Well, you guys are going to populate it into the MLS when you put it in there. All right. Broker obligations. I just want to go over this because it changed a little bit. Some language in here that I don't like the way it's worded here, so I'm going to word it a little bit differently. But broker obligations, broker agrees to make diligent and continued efforts to sell the property in accordance with the agreement until a sales contract is pending on the property. This includes cooperating and communicating with other brokers and making the property available for showings, except when it's not in the seller's best interest. All right, so I've just reversed the language on how it's written so you guys can understand it better. Because you are required to cooperate unless it's not in the seller's best interest. There has been times when I get calls from other brokers and agents, and we get emails saying, so-and-so is not responding to me. Oh my gosh, your agent isn't picking up their phone, isn't responding. I've got to do this and that. And the reality is that's okay if it's not in the seller's best interest to respond to you. So, a lot of people don't realize that you don't have to necessarily, only when it's the seller's not in their best interest. If it is in their best interest, you are required to cooperate and respond to everyone. So, all right, I'm also going to point out here at the bottom, they've changed the wording here to say authorized associate. Okay, so broker, it used to say broker / sales associate. Now it says broker / authorized associate. You guys are authorized to sign these documents on behalf of the brokerage. That's going to be one of the changes in your independent contractor agreement because I'm going to specifically identify that you are authorized to sign these agreements on behalf of the brokerage. Now, there will be limitations on what you're allowed to put in here, but you are authorized to sign them. So I'm not giving you free reign to write whatever you want in here because that could get us into trouble. But you will be authorized to sign these documents. Okay. All right. Moving on. Everything else is the same here on the second page here. They did put some disclosures in here that is just compliance with the settlement that it's at the bottom of every single page that says parties acknowledge this form should not be used to share offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other broker representatives via any fields in the MLS. So you're not allowed to hide the offer of compensation anywhere, put it in realtor remarks, put it in showing time, anything that syndicates from the MLS, you're not allowed to do that. The tool that we are going to be rolling out does not syndicate from the MLS. It syndicates from inputs that you put in, which is going to be critical when I go over that part, that you are getting your paperwork in timely. So we'll go over that at that point in time, but it doesn't syndicate from the MLS how we're going to do it. All right, now let's get into the compensation field, which Section 8 has always been the compensation field. Nothing's changed about that. And the compensation field it hasn't changed at all except for a small section that says seller will compensate broker as specified below. It used to say for procuring a buyer. Now it says if a buyer is procured. Little cleaned up language there. Not a big deal there. And then it continues on. Now they also got rid of the plus sales tax. I mentioned that at one of the trainings. I don't know why, because that's never been really in practice. But this has been in here. All right. So what we are doing now, by the way, is because of the way these negotiations are going to be taking place, where the seller has an opportunity to choose, we're going to modify some of the fields that we pre-populate in these documents. So I'm going to go over that in a little bit. I'm going to talk about the plus our $9.95 fee and plus what we're taking away from the co-broke agent as additional compensation to us in a little bit, because I want to go down to section number 9 and section number 10, which is the critical change to this listing agreement. So before section number 9 here, before we all know that we agree with the seller what the overall compensation was going to be, and then we agree with the seller how much we're going to give to the buyer's agent. That's historically how it's all been done, and the MLS memorialized that. With it coming off the MLS, now either the seller can still do it how they've done it before, whereby we negotiate an overall commission, and then we pay that commission we pay the buyer's agent commission out of our commission. Nothing's changed. The only change is the field is not going to be on the MLS, and we're going to have a separate database that people can tap into to be able to get that information. So the section of the contract that goes over that is pretty much the same. But there's two new sections that are in the listing agreement now. Those sections say the seller is going to compensate the buyer's agent directly, or no compensation is going to be offered to the buyer's agent. Okay? So, section number 9 says seller, some of this is language to comply with the lawsuit, and some of it, and then the language that changes this agreement is the practical application of this. But number 9 says it's a notice to the seller regarding buyer brokers. The buyer's broker, even if compensated by seller or broker, will provide services for the buyer. Seller is advised and aware that seller may, but is not required to, compensate the buyer's broker upon closing. Seller may choose to enter in a separate agreement, written agreement, to pay the buyer's broker, or may approve the broker to pay the buyer's broker in accordance with paragraph 10 below. Seller also understands that a buyer broker may include this broker, so that would be the transaction brokerage, if the broker also works with a buyer on this transaction. So that's the transaction brokerage aspect of this. Or B, if this occurs during the duration of this listing, broker will be entitled to compensation in paragraph 8 above for services performed for the seller, as well as the buyer broker compensation in 10A below for services performed for the buyer. Seller should therefore take this into consideration when negotiating compensation. And then C, broker may receive separate compensation from the buyer for services rendered by the broker. So this is saying that if we act as a transaction broker, then we're going to be paid in accordance with paragraph 10 below. Now, paragraph 10 below gives them the choices. All right. So section A, it's first off says all commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. So that's just legalese regarding the settlement agreement. And the seller approves the following. It says check all that apply. Now you can't check A and B and C because they contradict each other, but you can check potentially A and B if you really wanted to. But check all that apply. If no option is checked, then option C is to be deemed selected, which is no compensation will be offered. All right, so option C is no compensation is offered to the buyer from the seller, either through the brokerage, the listing agent, or through directly to the buyer's agent. All right, but option A here is the seller authorizes the broker to offer compensation to the buyer's broker in the amount of whatever percent of the purchase price or a flat amount. This will be paid from the broker to the buyer's broker, just as it always has been done. So if they select option A, it's the same as we've always done it before. Okay? If they select option A, then there's going to be a second agreement. Because the agreement is not on the MLS anymore, there's going to be a separate agreement, which is seller's broker to buyer broker, that's going to be signed between the brokerages. It's not exactly like the referral agreement that we've had before, but it's similar to the referral agreement where it's not signed by the seller, it's not signed by the buyer, it's a broker to broker document. I will go over that in a little bit. Okay? That is as if option A is selected, business as usual, as we've always done it, and we will compensate the buyer's broker. Okay. If option B is selected, then the seller authorizes the broker to offer compensation to the buyer's broker from the seller. From the seller. So we are going to disclose to the buyer's broker, the seller is going to pay you direct whatever amount. Okay? And it says in the amount of a purchase price or a flat dollar amount. This compensation will be set forth in a separate written agreement between the seller and buyer's broker. So if option B is selected, there will be a different document that is signed by the seller. All right. And I'll go over those. I'm just going to kick to those right now since they kind of tie together. So if option A is selected, then there is a compensation agreement, seller's broker to buyer's broker, that is signed by you as the representative of the seller's broker, if we're on the listing side, as an authorized agent of Impact Realty, authorized associate, and the buyer's broker, presumably their agent, if their broker authorizes them to sign it. Okay. If we're on the buy side, then we're going to be on the buy side of this agreement. All right. And it's whatever is agreed upon. So because it's not on the MLS, we're going to have a database that's going to publish this information per the terms of the listing agreement that's signed by the seller. And then we're going to have to enter in this separate agreement. So this would be the document that is used in the event that section A of paragraph 10 is checked. Okay. Note, in this document, there is an arbitration clause. You are required. This is one of the decisions that I am making as the broker, that I am saying that you are required to fill out the arbitration form with the other brokerage. All right. We're not going to sue each other. We are going to arbitrate in the event that there is a commission dispute. Okay. So you must fill this out and have the other brokers sign this. All right. I suspect most brokerages are going to do this, but then you just sign seller's broker to buyer broker, and it's pretty simple. You're filling out the percentage that's offered, that's agreed upon. Okay. All right. So that is broker to broker for section A. If it is section B that is checked on the listing agreement, then you're going to do seller to buyer's broker. Okay. So if we're on the listing side, we're going over the listing agreement right now. So we're on the listing side. We do not sign this document. This is seller to buyer's broker direct. So the buyer's broker would be filled in here. The seller would be filling in here. The agreed upon terms per the listing agreement, unless it gets modified, would be filled in here. And the seller execute it and the buyer's broker executes it. Okay. We also have the arbitration clause in here. Now, I'm also going to mandate that if option B is selected, which is then saying seller to buyer's broker, then you get this document signed by the seller at the listing agreement signature time. So that we won't know who the buyer's broker is at the time, but we'll know every other field of this document at that time because it's dictated by the listing agreement. And I don't want to get into a situation that we are publishing to other brokerages that you're going to be compensated by the seller a certain amount. And then when push comes to shove, when it's time to them actually sign the document, the seller says, oh no, I'm not agreeing to that anymore for XYZ reasons. So we're not going to get into that situation because then that creates liability for yourself, for us, for potentially the other agent, and the seller. So we're going to get it signed. The seller's half of this executed per the terms of the listing agreement at the listing agreement signature. So this would be for option B. All right, in the exclusive brokerage listing agreement. Now, if option C is selected, then you don't have to do anything. There's no compensation offered to the buyer's broker. So when you guys are having these conversations with your sellers, I touched about this during one of the sales meetings. If you're having these conversations with one of your sellers, you need to be very frank with them and discuss that in order to get the highest and best price and the best terms for the sale of their property, they need the largest pool of buyers possible looking at the property and potentially being able to buy the property. And there are loan programs out there that are very beneficial to buyers, whereby the buyers don't have to come up with a lot of cash out of pocket. Therefore, if they don't have a lot of cash that they can potentially put towards the closing costs, then they're relying on the cash to come from somewhere else, which means that it's going to be beneficial. It will always be beneficial for a seller to offer compensation to a buyer's agent, because that opens up a larger buyer pool. If the seller is reluctant for whatever reason, then they need to factor it into their listing price and factor it into any offer that they accept. Very simple math. If they were going to list a property for $100,000 with a 3% commission to a buyer's agent, they just need to think of the property as, okay, I'm netting $97,000. If they say, no, I want to net the 100, then they need to increase their listing amount and potentially offers accepted by that percentage. It's very simple how they do this. If you want to use an analogy, there was an analogy I saw on social media yesterday that was a great analogy, and it has to do with fishing. So you can have this conversation with the seller saying, hey, Mr. Seller, have you ever gone fishing before? Do you like fishing? Have you ever watched fishing? Do you know anything about fishing? If you go fishing, at the end of your line on the fishing rod, there is either a hook, and on that hook, there is bait on that hook. You're always going to throw a hook out with bait on it or potentially a lure on it when you're going fishing. You're never going to throw an empty line out into the water and hope a fish bites your empty line or a hook out in the water with no bait on it. You're not going to go throw a hook in the water and hope a fish comes by and bites an empty hook, because they're not going to do that. So you want some bait on that hook, and you want to attract as many buyers as possible. In order to do so, you're going to want to put some compensation in there. You can either do it through seller concessions, which is going to be on the MLS, and the buyer can choose what to do with those seller concessions, or you can do it through buyer's agent compensation, or you can do both if you want. But all of that just gets factored into the gross listing amount and the gross offer that you are willing to accept. It's really simple. Nothing really has changed with this whole settlement, and that's why I don't want you guys to over sensationalize this or freak out. It's literally just moving money around is all it's doing. And so we just need to educate our sellers and say, okay, no problem. We are going to offer some compensation to the buyer's agent and or seller concessions. We'll factor that into the amount, the gross amount we publish, and we factor it into any offers that come through. It's that simple. Okay. So those are the major changes to the listing agreement. Now, with that said, like I said, we are making some decisions on behalf of the brokerage that are going to benefit you. One of the fields in the brokerage was cooperative on the MLS was cooperative compensation. And in our marketplace, there has always been, not always, but almost every brokerage out there, actually, they call it a different fee, an administrative fee, an MLS fee, whatever they call it. And they take away some compensation from the co-op agent. In our instance, we've always done $295. We're increasing that to $395 because it's still going to be out there, and it provides more revenue for the brokerage and potentially is going to provide more revenue for you guys. And here's why it's going to provide more revenue for you guys. We're going to have to put in line 10A your percentage minus $395, which we're going to take away from the buyer's agent. However, in section number 8, which was the traditional section, we had always, in our listing agreements, put the percentage plus our $995 fee. Well, in the event that a seller decides to select option B or C below, meaning that they're going to pay the buyer's agent direct, or there's no buyer agent compensation. In the event that that happens, then you guys would be obligated to pay that additional compensation that we normally take away from the buyer's agent. However, we're going to increase the amount on line A to cover our $9.95 fee plus what we typically are going to take away, which is going to be increased to $3.95. So $9.95 plus $3.95. So we're going to increase that to $13.90. And in the event that they select option A below, you just made yourself an extra $395 because we're still taking compensation away from the buyer's agent. So it's an opportunity for you guys to actually reap the benefits of getting more compensation in your pocket. It doesn't take anything away from you, and it just shifts money around on where it's going to be on the listing agreement and protects from you guys having to come out of pocket for that. So that number is going to increase to $13.90. Now, you might have a seller that says, well, why am I paying this? Why aren't you paying this? And here's the matter of fact reason why they're paying that. It's because us as a brokerage are protecting them. And I cannot tell you how many situations I get calls, emails, texts about where the seller is doing something that's inappropriate, or the other agent is doing something that's inappropriate. It happened this week where we were going to put some people in their place. We are there to protect the client. And that's why they're paying us. And so therefore, by virtue of us training you and us, making sure that you have the correct documentation in place, and when squirrely things happen, we know where to go with it. That's why they're paying us, is to protect them, to minimize their risk. And I'll be honest with you, there is more litigation now than there has ever been in the real estate industry. We've experienced it. We've had to defend things. I've had to put people in their place. I've had to work with our Arizona Mission Company on situations, on things where our agents didn't do anything wrong, but they still, someone decided to still file a lawsuit. You need to have these conversations with these sellers to say, there's more litigation than ever in this industry, and it's probably not going to stop. It's probably going to increase. And we are here to make sure that you are minimizing your risk. And that's why you need us. All right. And that's why they're paying us that fee. Okay. All right. So we're putting things in place to benefit you guys and protect you guys. All right. Now, with this said, this is going to be critically important. So important that we are going to be on you like white on rice. Whatever analogy you want to use. It is critically important that you get your .loop certification in before the listing goes live. Because that .loop certification is going to have a field in it that has seller concessions and cooperative broker compensation. That document is what's going to feed the databases that we push out to the world that describes the compensation that's being offered. We are developing a website which is being tested and will be live before the August 6th deadline, whereby you're not going to have to field the phone calls from cooperative agents saying, what's the offer of compensation to us? Because it's not on the MLS anymore. So immediately we are now taking work off of your plate, but it is critical that you have that .loop certification in before the listing goes live. And I am now mandating, I don't want to do this because I really hope you guys comply with this, but in the event that we catch a listing on the MLS that is not, that you don't have a .loop certification in, we are going to give you 24 hours to get that to us. And if not, we're pausing the listing on the MLS. So that's how serious this is. And that's the decisions I'm having to make as a broker to make sure that everything runs smoothly. You may not have a listing out there on the MLS without that .loop certification in, that then lets us know what the compensation is, which then automatically feeds everything. And that .loop certification is the trigger. There is not going to be a manual process. That is the manual process. So it's not like the certification's coming in and then our staff has to take a look at it, manually enter it, and then it goes out. Because what happens when you put a listing live over the weekend or on Friday night at 10 o'clock, we don't have staff in the office. It's automatic, guys. You don't have to do anything other than put that .loop certification in. So that's how critical it is. And we are going to be very, very diligent and serious about making sure you do that before a listing goes live. Okay? That is all that's needed to put us ahead of the game with everybody else. And these websites, QR codes, text messaging, whatever it is that you know, the additional ways to get it out there to people, it's automatically going to run. So you won't have to do a single thing other than get that certification is. Okay? So that's how critical it is. All right. I think that's all I've got on this listing agreement. Authorized sales associate, the dispute resolution clause, you must get that signed as well in this, because we are not going to be going and suing people. We are going to arbitrate. So make sure that you are getting that certification signed there. Okay. All right. That's it on the exclusive broker authorization form or listing agreement, exclusive brokerage listing agreement. All right. Next up, we're going to get into compensation agreements for the buyers. All right. So for the buyer compensation agreements, you've got the exclusive buyer broker agreement. And then you've got you have a showing agreement, and you have another form, which is called the pre-touring agreement. There's a new pre-touring agreement out there, which I'll talk about in a little bit. For this section, I'm actually going to divert back to Joanna for the buyer broker agreement. This is about a 20-minute video. She has a lot of very good points in this video, and I want you guys to pay very, very close attention to it. And then I'm going to come back and give you my interpretation of this. Okay? So this is very important. Yes, we will review all questions at the end, by the way. This is very important that you watch this video, take notes. I will come back and I will give you my interpretation of this. I will then talk about even more tools that we're offering at the brokerage to make things seamless for you. All right, so this is critical. Go ahead and watch this, and I'll begin.
Hello, my name is Joanna Watkins, and I have the honor of serving as Florida Realtors Vice President of Law and Policy and General Counsel. Thank you for joining me today as we talk buyer-broker agreements. This is an extremely timely and consequential topic of conversation right now. As you know, on March 15th, 2024, the National Association of Realtors announced a proposed settlement agreement to end class action litigation of claims brought on behalf of home sellers related to broker commissions. The settlement covered a number of crucial issues. Two of those issues have received a lot of attention in recent months, as these two issues have driven practice changes within our industry. NAR has set a deadline for members, multiple listing services, and boards covered by the settlement to incorporate those practice changes into their businesses no later than August 17, 2024. The two issues of note are, first, NAR has agreed to prohibit offers of compensation on the multiple listing service. There will continue to be many ways in which buyer brokers can continue to be compensated, including through offers of compensation communicated off the multiple listing service. But using the multiple listing service to communicate offers of compensation is no longer an option. And the settlement provides that multiple listing service participants working with buyers must enter into written buyer agreements prior to touring a home. It is the second issue of written buyer representation agreements that we will discuss today. Now let's talk written agreements. The settlement calls for written buyer agreements. Keep in mind that the language of the settlement is very broad and is designed to apply to all 50 states, but today we will personalize this to Florida. The terms of this buyer agreement are not specifically defined, but the settlement does give the required elements for written buyer agreements. The written agreement must include 1, a specific and conspicuous disclosure of the amount or rate of compensation the participant will receive, or how this amount will be determined to the extent that the participant will receive compensation from any source. 2, the amount of compensation in a manner that is objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. 3, a term that prohibits the participant from receiving compensation for brokerage services from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed to in the written agreement with the buyer. And 4, a conspicuous statement that broker fees and commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. For more information on this, take a look at NAR's frequently asked question number 54. As we talk today, if I can refer you to a particular FAQ posted on the NAR site, I will do so. I find it is very helpful to know exactly where to find the source of this crucial information. These written agreements must be presented to and signed by buyers prior to touring a property. In the frequently asked questions published by NAR on facts.realtor, NAR explains that touring means when the buyer and/or the MLS participant or other agent, at the direction of the MLS participant working with the buyer, enters the house. This includes the MLS participant or other agent at the direction of the MLS participant working with the buyer, entering the home to provide a live virtual tour to a buyer not physically present. So yes, a virtual tour can count as touring a property, according to NAR's frequently asked question number 57. Okay, but how do I determine if I am working with a buyer? The working with language is intended to distinguish MLS participants who provide broker services to a buyer, such as identifying potential properties, arranging for the buyer to tour property, performing or facilitating negotiations on behalf of the buyer, presenting offers by a buyer or other services for the buyer, from the MLS participant who simply markets their services or just talks to a buyer at an open house, or by providing an unrepresented buyer access to a house they have listed. If the MLS participant is working only as an agent of the seller, then the participant is not working with the buyer. In that scenario, an agreement is not required because the participant is performing work for the seller and not the buyer. So now that I've told you what the settlement requires in a written agreement with the buyer, let me tell you what the settlement does not require. NAR policy does not dictate the type of relationship the professional has with the potential buyer. And by that, I mean agency relationships, like transaction brokers or single agents. It does not dictate the term of the agreement. It can be a month, a day. It can be one house or a whole zip code. It does not cover the services to be provided. That's completely up to the parties. It can be a certain number of showings. It can include negotiations or presenting offers. And it does not dictate the compensation charge. Compensation is negotiable. It can be a flat fee, a percentage, or whatever rate the parties decide on. So as a part of complying with the settlement, the legal team at Florida Realtors worked with the Presidential Advisory Group, various committees, the leadership team, and other members of our association to assist in identifying the preferences of our membership for amending existing forms and creating new forms. There were several forms already in existence that could be used between the buyer and the broker to comply with this written agreement. Today, we will focus on one of those forms, the Exclusive Buyer-Broker Agreement. This is the form EBBA in the Form Simplicity Library. Written buyer representation forms, like the Exclusive Buyer-Broker Agreement form, are not new in Florida. This form has recently been updated to incorporate the settlement changes, but this form had a previous effective date of 2016. It has been around for years and has been used in thousands of transactions by your fellow realtors here in Florida. The requirements of the settlement will undoubtedly cause an increase in the use of this form in coming months. So what should you expect when using the Exclusive Buyer-Broker Agreement form? Well, if you choose to use this form, first, you should go to the Forms library to select the form. You will notice that the form has a version for each of the approved agency disclosure relationships in Florida. There is one for single agency, transaction broker, and the no brokerage option. Now, it is important to note that I said when you go to the Forms library. It has always been important to use the most current version of the forms that we publish. And now more than ever, it is critically important that you do so. In the past, forms have changed for a variety of legal and practice-related reasons. But remember that the settlement requires certain mandatory disclosures that must be made in order to be covered by the settlement. We talked about those a few minutes ago, and it is critical that you ensure that you are using the most current version of the buyer-broker agreement. So for the time being, make sure you go and pull those forms down from the Forms library. Make sure you have the version of the document with the June 2024 revision date. Now, on to the document itself. For purposes of our discussion today, we will talk about the EBBA 7TB. That's the form number. That is the transaction broker version of the Exclusive Buyer-Broker Agreement form. Now let's start at the top, paragraph 1 of the Buyer-Broker Agreement. Paragraph 1 sets forth the parties to this contract. And keep in mind that this is indeed a contract. The buyer is referred to as the consumer, a more generic term that you will see in most of our broker services agreements moving forward, to describe the person to whom the broker is providing services. Here, the consumer is the buyer, and potentially the buyer who becomes the lessee, but we'll talk about that a little later. The consumer and the broker, and by broker, it includes the agent of the broker assigned to work with the consumer. They state early on in paragraph 1 that they are creating an exclusive relationship. The consumer has granted the broker this exclusive right to work with and assist them in the purpose of locating and negotiating the acquisition of suitable property. This acquisition can happen in many ways, and they state that this can happen by the purchase, of course, of a property, but also by option, exchange, or even lease, as I mentioned earlier, in the case where a consumer evolves from a buyer to a lessee. Now, moving on to paragraph 2, the parties here decide how long they will work together by stating the term. There's a start date and a termination date to be filled in by the parties. For clarity, we specify that the termination ends at 11:59 p.m. One important issue to note about that term provision, much like the language in our listing agreements, if the parties enter into a sell and purchase contract or other agreement to acquire property, that is the actual language contained in the agreement, the term will extend through the closing of that agreement. That brings us to paragraph 3, the property. This is the place for the parties to specify the type of property the consumer is interested in, or in other words, what is considered a suitable property. Now, this is the first place where the prior version of the buyer-broker agreement and the current version is noticeably different. The criteria have been shortened to only include types of property and location. Factors such as price have been removed from the new version. If you and the consumer wish to further define what is considered a suitable property, you would do so in paragraph 13 under other terms. Now, broker obligations is listed under paragraph 4 of the agreement. This paragraph has remained very similar to the previous version of this form. Under 4A, though, please note that the last point states that the broker will cooperate with real estate licensees and with the owner to complete the transaction, making it clear that there is cooperation that goes well beyond just money. 4B also states that the consumer understands that even if the broker is compensated by an owner or a real estate licensee who is working with an owner, such compensation does not compromise the broker's duty to the consumer. The agreement provides the consumer assurances that compensation from the seller or the listing broker will not nullify the obligation broker agrees to provide in this section. Moving on to paragraph 5. This paragraph sets forth consumer obligations. These are fairly straightforward activities performed by consumers during the transaction. Now, paragraph 6 provides for the parties to agree to an optional retainer. It is a non-refundable sum for services provided by the broker to the consumer. The agreement specifies that the sum is earned and payable upon execution of the agreement to help reinforce the non-refundable nature of the fee. Moving on to paragraph 7. This takes us to the heart of the settlement and how it impacts the agreement. The goal of this paragraph is to provide the parties with flexibility in how to structure compensation and to do so in a clear, objectively ascertainable way. We start with how compensation is earned. When during the term of the agreement, consumer contracts to acquire real property, or defaults on a contract, compensation is earned. The form then states some pretty critical terms of compensation. First, the form clarifies that the compensation here is for services rendered to the consumer. In other words, the compensation outlined here is not for listing services on a property the buyer selects that is also listed by the broker. Those are services to the seller, not the buyer. Another critical issue addressed here is what happens if the seller or the listing broker agrees to pay this broker for services to this consumer. So for example, for bringing this buyer to a listing, this agreement states that the amount the seller or listing broker agrees to pay will reduce the amount the buyer agrees to pay in paragraph 7. So how do they define the amount to pay? The parties are able to fill in the blanks to the compensation section based on their agreement. It is very important to remember that the parties may elect to fill in multiple options. For instance, the parties may complete the purchase and the lease subsections if the buyer is not sure the financing will come through and they may need to lease prior to the purchase of the property. It is completely up to them. So let's look at each section. First is the purchase. The form allows for purchase or exchange compensation to be defined. In that section, the parties can fill in a dollar amount or a percentage, or they can fill in a dollar amount and a percentage plus a bonus amount. Again, it is completely up to the parties. But note that the fee is defined as payable not later than the date of the closing, but the fee is earned regardless of the closing. If the consumer defaults on the sales contract and never closes, the fee may still be owed to the broker. The leasing and options sections are very similar. There are multiple options to define compensation, and it is specified that those fees are payable when the consumer enters into a lease purchase or an option to purchase. As you can see, there are many options to structure compensation and additional spaces given for the parties to enter other terms that are unique to their relationship. Maximum flexibility for compensation structure between the consumer and the broker has always been our goal, and in this post-settlement world, it is more important than ever. The last few paragraphs of the document covers some very interesting topics. Let's talk about the protection period and conditional termination. The protection period provides that the consumer will compensate broker if, within a specified number of days after the termination of the agreement, the consumer contracts to acquire any property which was called to consumers' attention by broker or any other person, or found by the consumer during the term of this agreement. However, the consumer's obligation to pay the broker's fee ceases upon the consumer entering into a good faith exclusive buyer-broker agreement with another broker after the termination date. The conditional termination language in paragraph 9 provides that at the consumer's request, the broker may agree to conditionally terminate this agreement. If the broker agrees to the conditional termination, the consumer must enter a written agreement with the broker terminating the agreement, and setting forth the conditions of that termination, including the payment of a termination fee in the amount set forth in that agreement. If from the early termination date to the termination date plus any protection period, the consumer contracts to acquire any property, the broker may void the conditional termination, and the consumer would then be obligated to pay the fees stated in the compensation paragraph, minus any cancellation fee. So what happens when a dispute arises under this agreement? Well, the dispute resolution sections should be familiar language to you. It is substantially the same as the language in our listing agreements and many other forms in the Florida Realtors Form Simplicity Library. It allows the parties to litigate the matters pursuant to the laws of Florida, but it also allows the parties to initial the agreement and to opt in to arbitration as a way to resolve the disputes in order to avoid litigation. Much like the dispute process in our listing agreements, paragraph 11 allows the brokers to assign this buyer-broker agreement and states that the document is binding on heirs, personal representatives, successors, and assigns. Paragraph 12 addresses the brokerage relationship set forth in statute. There is so much chatter about the impact of the settlement on the transaction-broker relationship. I would encourage you to remember, contractual obligations as defined in a buyer-broker agreement are not necessarily the same as fiduciary responsibilities under statute. I look forward to providing additional resources specific to that topic in the near future. But for now, please remember that the settlement does not prohibit the transaction brokerage relationship. The other terms section in paragraph 13 allows the parties to write in any special aspects of their relationship in this section of the agreement. And finally, paragraph 14 contains a number of very important provisions. Bolded and underlined is language that is required by the settlement. The agreement states that brokerage commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. Also spelled out is the requirement to state that the broker may not receive compensation from any source that exceeds the amount or rate agreed with the consumer. The last sentence is very important language, and it states that the consumer agrees that the broker may receive a separate amount of compensation from the owner of the property for services rendered to the owners as listing broker. This is to make it clear that the consumer may ultimately select a listing that the broker has, and that the broker may be paid a listing fee for working with the seller. This is to ensure the type of transparency and informed decision-making that the settlement wants for the consumer. Now, one last thing about the form. The form can be signed by the broker or an authorized agent of the broker. This may be a really good time for brokerages to give some thought for how agents are authorized to complete and sign forms, maybe as a part of your independent contractor agreement or your policy and procedures manual. Ultimately, the latest version of the buyer-broker agreement is not dramatically different from previous versions. The document does serve the purpose of incorporating the elements of the settlement while providing maximum flexibility for the parties to structure their agreement. Now, undoubtedly, you have questions. Having the documents that set out the terms of the settlement is one thing. Knowing how and when to use those documents is completely different. Starting today and in the coming weeks, we will work hard to answer those questions for you. Some of those questions we can answer here at Florida Realtors, and some of those questions we must seek answers from NAR. But we will diligently pursue the information as well as continue to develop and release forms and other tools that you need to successfully make this pivot. So let's get started with some of those questions that I know you.
All right. So thank you guys for paying attention to that. There were some good comments in the chat, so I could tell that you guys were paying attention, and I appreciate you guys doing that. And as you can tell, she did do a very good job explaining some of these documents. But I do have some comments on what she described. So first off, she did mention an FAQ. So there is an FAQ out there. It's on the NAR site. It is just, if you just Google NAR Settlement FAQs, it'll come up, updated yesterday. So they are constantly updating this. And they've got all kinds of FAQs in here about different situations and whatnot. One thing that is a very common question, she did mention it on the recording there, is open houses. So that was something I had thought about immediately, is how this is going to be addressed. And open houses, you are not required to, if you are doing an open house on behalf of a seller, you are not required, or a listing agent, who is on behalf of the seller, you are not required to get a written agreement signed for every single person that walks through the door, because you are not providing them services. However, the whole goal of an open house is to take those unrepresented buyers and convert them to your clients. So there is going to be a point in time when you guys are starting to provide brokerage services to those unrepresented buyers. At that point in time is when you are going to start getting written agreements in place. So it could be that you end up, they're interested in the actual open house and you end up representing them on that open house. Well, there's going to be a point in time where you're going to have to go ahead and get that written buyer broker agreement, or one of the other forms that I'm about to go over, signed by that buyer or consumer, as they are now being referred to. The other situation would be if they're not interested in the house that they walked into, but you want to convert them and provide brokerage services to them to sell them a different house. Well, at that point in time, you are going to once again have to enter into a written agreement before touring houses with them. So it's going to be specific on how the conversation's going, on when you actually get that agreement signed. But prior to an open house, if they're just walking in blindly off the street, the FAQ says you do not have to actually go out and get an agreement signed. So, all right. Another thing that she went over was virtual tours. So just because you are not with your client, if you are touring a home and have them on FaceTime or Facebook, or whatever, if you are showing a property on behalf of, or even recording it, in my opinion, and sending the recording to your client, you need that written agreement in place. Okay, whether it's one of the three that we're about to go over. All right. Now, the ones that we're going to go over are going to be the ones that are in .loop. We are going to be using the transaction brokerage ones in .loop. So everything that we do, we're defaulting to transaction brokerage because it makes the most sense. All the other ones that are available will be available in Form Simplicity, and you can use them if you want. But I promise you, 90-something percentage of you guys are going to end up using the transaction brokerage one. So let's go back to what she went over. And I am once again making some decisions that will benefit for you. All right, so the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. We actually went through this on our sales meeting, I believe, last time, because this had already been released. And we talked about the word buyer has changed to consumer. We talked about how some of these fields went away. And the only fields left are type of property, and location. Now, in my opinion, you want these two fields to be as broad as possible, because, as she mentioned in the agreement, or in the recording, the settlement agreement does not dictate type of property, length of time, location. It doesn't dictate anything. It could be for one specific property, for 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, or it could be for a year. But you can't, that does have to have an end date. You are not allowed to make it open-ended forever. So if you want to do the term of the agreement, you want it as long as possible. Listing agreements are typically for a year if you can get them. So I would highly recommend, this one be for a year if you can get it for a year. But you don't, the more short it is, then the more limitations you have on that. Okay. Now, type of property. If you noticed in her presentation, this line is blank. In .loop, I am making the executive decision for Impact Realty that we are going to put a little term that is often used in contracts that says, if blank, any residential property, any residential or commercial property. That means you're covered for anything. Technically, the settlement does not cover leases and does not cover commercial properties. However, those are services that you provide to clients, and therefore the leases are already embedded in this, but commercial is not. So I'm just saying, hey, if it's a commercial property, residential property, it doesn't matter. Technically, the settlement only covers residential, which is 1 to 4 units. The definition of residential property, 1 to 4 units. But if you go over 4 units, you go to 5 units. And the way I've got this filled out already, pre-populated for you, you're covered. You don't have to do anything. You wouldn't even have to fill in anything on this dotted line. Same with location. I put, if blank, any property located in the state of Florida. You're licensed to conduct business anywhere in the state of Florida. If the buyer that you have a buyer broker agreement is aloof and doesn't know exactly what they want, you want this as broad as possible. So you could put a specific property address in there. You could put a specific county or specific zip code or whatever, or I'm just making it as vague as possible for what you are licensed. It still complies with the agreement because it is specific. It's not open-ended in any way, and any property in the state of Florida. So take with it what you want. If you want to be more specific, put something in there. But in my opinion, I just leave it blank and say any property. All right. We went over a lot of this already, and she went over a lot of this already. I do want to mention the part at the end here that is critical. I've touched on it already, but broker may not receive compensation for any amount that exceeds the amount or rate agreed upon with the consumer in this document. All right, so this is the exclusive buyer broker relationship document agreement. This is your cap. You can't go higher than this, so you might as well go as high as you can in this. All right, and point out to that buyer that any amount of compensation that I receive from the listing agent or the seller direct will reduce any amounts that are paid here. So there's a chance you'll come out of pocket for zero. And that would be your goal in negotiations, is for them to come out of pocket for zero. All right. So that's the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. Now, with that said, I'm going to go back to Joanna because there are 2 other agreements. One which was in place before called a showing agreement. One that was not in place before which is brand new, called a property pre-touring agreement. So let me go back to her real quick. She gives a decent analogy here. And let me play this.
A lot on the exclusive buyer broker agreement. I'm going to touch on 2 others because I want you to know that those are options. The showing agreement is also an option available to you. It has been an option. The showing agreement has been in Form Simplicity's library for a very long time. But we also have the new property pre-touring agreement, right? And this is a continuum, these forms. Over here, you have the exclusive buyer broker agreement, which is the one we talked about today. On this end of the spectrum, you have the property pre-touring agreement. In the middle here, you have the showing agreement. I kind of equate them to dating. I'm not sure, if that's like legally the most sound analogy, but I like a good analogy. Over here, you got the pre-touring agreement form. We're just kind of going out for coffee, right? We want to work with each other. We want to see each other, but I'm not sure about this dating thing with you, customer, because I don't really know you that well. But I'm gonna give you what is legally required under the settlement in order to tour properties with you. So we're kind of going out for coffee on our date. In the middle here, we have the showing agreement. This is some casual dating. We're dating each other, but it's not completely exclusive. It's exclusive as to the properties specified on our contract only, right? By zip code, by list of properties, whatever the case may be. But we're just kind of casually dating each other, but only as it relates to these properties. Over here, the exclusive buyer broker agreement, we are married. We have committed to work with each other for a period of time until you find that property that you are interested in. It doesn't matter how you find it, who finds it for you. You have committed to me as the person who you are going to work with. So that is kind of the continuum of forms that Florida Realtors has made available to you. Now, a lot of folks say, Joanna, which forms do I have to use? Well, as brokers, that's one of the things I want to talk to you about today. It is completely up to you.
All right. So she gave a good analogy there. When she's ad-libbing and she's not reading off of a prompter, she actually has some funny comments there. I like her. All right. So we've got the two other agreements. We went over the exclusive buyer broker agreement, which means, as in her analogy, we're married. That's what we want to go for. All right. That's what we want to go for. However, I know darn well that there's going to be circumstances, buyer circumstances, agents that are uncomfortable, and they're going to want to cop out and go with something lesser than this. So we'll go to the showing agreement, which I'm not going to go through this, but it is a modified version of the exclusive buyer broker agreement. As she said, it's specific to those properties that you put in there. All right. So they're allowed to work with other people, basically, is what it's saying in a showing agreement. So you might, be working with them, but they're working with other agents, and it's not ideal. So that would be the middle one here. And then the pre-touring agreement is, like she called it, a cup of coffee. It's like, okay, we're getting something on paper to comply, but there's no exclusivity to it whatsoever. And we're just saying that, hey, you're going to compensate me if I find you a property, basically. So that's not the ideal situation. Please avoid the pre-touring agreement if you can. You really use this as an opportunity. This is like I said in the very beginning, use this as an opportunity to solidify your business and get compensated even more so for those business. So, all right. So those are the agreements that have come out. Now, what has not come out, I think someone even asked this in the chat, what has not come out yet is amended retainer agreements. There is a retainer agreement built into the exclusive buyer broker agreement, which, by the way, I'm going to point this out. This retainer portion, I talked about this at the sales meeting, is in additional compensation. So it says, under section 6 here, this retainer is in addition to any compensation earned by broker, broker and consumer agree that the retainer for real estate services described herein does not constitute a fee paid for rental information list as described in section whatever. So this is an addition. So you actually can keep a retainer and it doesn't ding you for the amount in the agreement. So all right, so there is an additional retainer agreement that's coming out. And then release of amended listing agreements and several other forms. One of those forms will address what you do with listings and buyer broker agreements that are effective on August 17th that do not have the required language for settlement compliance. All right, so they've got 16 days to get us the document for all of your current listings. So it's coming. Who knows? We'll address that as soon as it comes out. But that has not been sent out yet. So we have August 6th is when the MLS is pulling this off and pulling compensations off. And then August 17th is when it's in full effect. However, we have some agreements that haven't even been put out yet. All right. That's all the forms that are put out there yet. Now I'm going to once again touch on the Impact Realty, what we are putting out there for you guys. All right. So what we are putting out there for you guys to help you guys seamlessly do this. As we discussed, there will be a website accessible to other agents and technically the public, unless we decide to limit that. That's still up in the air, whether we let anyone look at it or just other realtors. That is going to have cooperative compensation on there, where they enter an address and they get the commissions offered and any kind of concessions offered. Now, concessions will be on the MLS, but we'll duplicate it there. That's why it's so critical for you to have your .loop certification in on time, because it is what is going to feed our internal website. We can only put our listings on our internal website. Now, it's going to be accessible by external people, but it is only our listings. So on what we are going to use as Impact Realty info, we will have lots of, well, technically we can put the link anywhere, but we can do it through a text message. We can do it through a QR code that you can put on your listings or in the house on a sheet of paper, scan this, enter the address. There's lots of ways to disseminate it, but it will be a centralized place that is automatic and you don't have to do anything other than do your .loop certification. So that is what's going to facilitate the dissemination to the public, and you won't have to ever take those phone calls. We are not allowed to put website links into the MLS. So we've got to figure out a way to disseminate that information. I'm not sure exactly how we're going to end up doing that, but we will have to, that will be the method of doing it. So it's, it's disseminated out there. It could just be some generic language. Anyway, we'll address that. All right, so that's the website. Additionally, for getting things signed on the go and whatnot, we already have the tool for that. So .loop allows you to do that. We will be able to put all of these documents into .loop, which you will be able to do from your mobile device. All right. If those of you guys that are already great with .loop, you might already know exactly how to do it. But these forms will be preloaded in .loop, and you guys can use them from your phone and shoot it out to your clients and whatnot. All right. We will have a separate class on specifically the .loop application of that. So that's not something we're going to go over today. We've already covered a lot today, and I'm going to get to your questions here in a little bit. So just be aware that everything's going to be live prior to the 6th when this implements, and you guys are in great hands. We've pretty much contemplated and are probably ahead of the game with regards to where other brokers are at, because I haven't seen them put anything out yet. We will say this. As part of the listing agreement, I have seen some articles and some news of some other brokerages that are not offering co-op commissions, which is interesting. And it's not really a bad idea either. I've got to give them credit. That just means that in the listing agreement, they're not allowing the sellers to select 10A, which is the cooperative where the broker pays the buyer's agent. That doesn't mean that on those listings, there is no buyer compensation. It just means they're requiring their sellers to select what's effectively 10B, and the seller pays them direct. And the reason why I say it's not really that bad of an idea is because it removes the brokerage liability from it. It's saying the NAR is removing their liability by taking it off the MLS. They're now putting it on us as the brokerages. That some brokers are out there and saying, no, I'm not taking that because we already got hosed on this settlement. So we're now putting it on the sellers and then taking ourselves out of it and saying, seller, you're required to compensate. So just be aware that if you see some things out there for specific brokerages that are not offering cooperative compensation, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is not compensation offered on that listing agreement. It just means that it's not coming from the broker, it's coming from the seller. So I don't know how other brokers are going to be handling their communication of this. I think we've got some pretty good ideas. It's kind of intuitive. I've seen some chatter in Facebook groups of agents freaking out on what to do. And, you know, I'm not freaking out at all because we've kind of already got our hands around it and are getting this implemented for you guys. So that's that. Just be aware of that. And I think that's all I've got with the actual documents. So I will go to questions on this right now. So I'm going to start at the top here and go through any questions that you have on here. Thank you for posting that, Marcus. The link. Thank you, Andy, for posting the .loop certification on there. Can we put this link to the new site in the description on the MLS? That's what we just. That's what I just addressed. I don't believe we can. However, we may. I want to say Neville or someone put in there. Can we include a document with the link as an attachment? We probably can. We probably can put as an attachment to the MLS an FAQ of where they can find cooperative compensation. I don't believe that would violate anything from this settlement. I'm thinking off the top of my head right now, and I can't see anywhere where an FAQ that says more information, you know, can be found at this website. I don't see there's any issue there. I don't think we will probably have specific language to cooperating compensation, but we probably will have more information. So I believe that's probably what we'll end up doing. What about existing listings? We covered that. Existing listings, there will be a document out there. They have not put it out yet. So we are still in limbo on existing listings. Okay. If we are the listing agent, can we include the $9.95 fee for the buyer's agent to pay in addition to the new $3.95 fee that we are charging? Okay, a couple of clarifications on there. The $3.95 fee is not a new fee; it's just being increased from $2.95 to $3.95. On listings, we've always collected our $9.95 fee from the seller and $2.95 from the buyer's agent. We're now just increasing the $2.95 to $3.95 from the buyer's agent. However, in the paperwork, and I'll share my screen again. In the paperwork, the way the paperwork is crafted, they because the seller can opt out of paying the buyer's broker, I'm protecting you guys. All right, so I am helping you guys to not have to pay anything out of pocket, number one, and number two, potentially get more. Because in the exclusive listing agreement, I'll go over this again here. In the section where we are offering cooperative compensation, so section A, which is exactly how the old method worked. Section A, it says the broker will compensate the buyer's agent whatever amount. We have traditionally populated this with a percent minus 295. We are now just increasing the 295 to 395. So it doesn't affect you at all. It's very accustomed in our market to do this. We're just increasing it. In fact, I'm making this decision, guys, just so you know, because we haven't increased our fees in 5 years. And as you are well aware, there is a lot going on in the economy that is causing increased costs. So I'm finding ways that are going to increase revenue for the brokerage to help offset some of those costs, but not come out of your pocket. So if you continue to use the documents as you always have and use what's pre-populated in there, nothing's going to come out of your pocket. All right. So seller authorizes broker to offer compensation to the buyer's broker of, just say 2.5%, 3% minus 395. That is what's in A. So therefore, if that's how it's traditionally done, and you go back up to section 8, traditionally what we would have is seller will pay broker as follows, whatever percent. We would typically have 5%, 6%, whatever percent plus 995. But that's because that's how we get paid. That's because we knew that we were taking from the buyer's agent before, and there was nothing, and it's already pre-populated in there. So that's how we did it. But in this instance, theoretically, the seller could opt 10B or 10C below, where we can't grab that money basically from the buyer's agent. So therefore, what we've done is increased line 113 here, A, to 1390. So the worst case scenario is you are not coming out of pocket at all. The best case, and some of you guys actually, we've seen it on closings. You guys can charge whatever you want. We're not mandating this. You guys can charge whatever you want. We have agents that charge way more than this and actually keep the difference. But us as a brokerage, this is what we retain as our revenue. So therefore, in the event that you keep this at the 1390, which is 995 plus 395, which really that 395 is what we're intending to grab from the buyer's agent, and they select B or C below, you're still not coming out of pocket for anything. If they select A below, then, and you don't alter what's in .loop, you leave this 395 in here, we are taking 395 from the buyer's agent, and you're getting an additional amount from the seller, which means that goes in your pocket. So I am creating a win-win situation for you guys that potentially could put more money in your pocket. However, in the event that they decide that they don't want to charge, they don't listen to your advice and they don't want to charge or they don't want to offer compensation to a buyer's agent, or they offer it direct to them, then you guys are not penalized in any way, shape, or form. So hopefully that addresses your questions there. Okay. So to answer Jamal, your question, are we charging the buyer's agent $13.90 instead of seller paying it? No, we're charging the seller $995 plus $395 regardless. And then in the event, now you could change that to $995 and keep it the same as we always have if you really want to. I wouldn't do that because I don't think anyone's going to blink an eye, to be honest with you. And that gives you an opportunity to grab some more money. In fact, I know that's the case because we watch our agents do it all the time, charge more than what we do. So, all right. Neville's comment: closing is not a prerequisite for broker fee to be earned. That is correct. That's always been correct. In fact, it happened this week where I got a call and we had a aggressive seller who was also the agent that was threatening not to close, and we were on the buy side, and I was going to go after them and say, by the way, closing is not a prerequisite for compensation being earned. You still owe us a commission. So that's always been the case. It's memorialized in the agreement now. Well, I think it's always been there, but they added it to make sure, she highlighted it to make sure that you guys recognize that. Theoretically, we could do all of our job and a buyer refuses to close at the end after all the contingencies have been met or passed or whatnot, and they could theoretically still owe us a commission. Now, that's why it's so critical for us to have the arbitration clause checked. So make sure that you have that arbitration clause checked, because going after a buyer or even a seller, to litigate, to sue them, to try and get the commission that's due to us is very expensive, and it oftentimes is not going to be make sense from a business standpoint unless it's a very large commission, which then they're gonna fight. So arbitration is a much smoother way to get paid what we are due and not have the litigation costs. So please make sure you are getting that arbitration. All right. All right. Question. While we obviously want to get the most compensation, if our buyer cannot pay the difference, is there an option for additional terms to cover that based on the client's buyer situation? So I think the question is, suppose you put 4% in your buyer broker agreement, or 3.5%, or 3%, or whatever it is, and the seller is offering less than that amount. So say you put 3.5% and the seller is offering 2.5%. Per the terms of this agreement, the contractually obligated amount, you can collect an extra 1% from that buyer. But I think the question is, what if the buyer doesn't have that money? You can reduce that amount. You are not allowed to go higher than what's in the agreement, but you can go lower. So it's up to you whether you want to have this conversation up front or not. I would hold the conversation for after you start showing properties and see which one they agree upon. Because what happens if you have 4% and the seller's offering a flat fee of $1,000 or whatnot, or maybe they're offering 1% and whatever. So it depends on what that discrepancy is going to be, but you do have the authority to reduce that. So the answer is yes. Is there guidance on how to collect and retain a retainer fee? All right. So the retainer, if you go back to the agreement, the exclusive broker agreement, I'll share my screen again. If you go back to the exclusive broker agreement, the retainer is due upon execution of this agreement. So retainer, a non-refundable retainer fee of whatever dollar amount for brokerage services provided to consumer. The retainer is earned and payable upon execution of this agreement. This retainer is additional compensation. So the instances where you would use a retainer, and I've encouraged our agents to use retainers. We have agents that have used retainers before and collected it. Would be an instance where honestly you're getting run around by that buyer. It could be an investor that wants you to do all kinds of work, but then that investor doesn't ever come through, or they put lowball offers in, or whatever it is. It's a good idea to use a retainer. Or if you got a client that's just unrealistic and you think you're going to be doing a ton of work for no reason. We had a listing where the seller wanted to modify some terms, and it was going to cause our agent to do a whole lot of work, and I didn't believe it was going to close. I would encourage a retainer to be used at that point in time. So no problem, I'll do this work for you, but you have to pay an upfront retainer. Historically, that retainer, the way the document read, was going to offset whatever was collected. So if you collect $1,000 retainer or a $5,000 retainer and you collect a commission on it, their commission due would be reduced by that retainer amount. It's been changed here now where it's additional compensation, which is good for you guys. So if you can collect a retainer, it does not count, the way this reads, towards the documentation, the language at the bottom that says you can't go over this amount. This is considered additional compensation. So certainly encourage in certain circumstances to try and get a retainer if you can. All right, maybe a silly question, but what happens if you have a consumer who is buying property, say in Tampa, but also looking at different property and simultaneously in the Florida Keys and is using a different agent in that region? Do we just update the location of the property, Tampa Bay region, or for the exclusive buyer agreement? Well, that's going to be determined upon what they have, what listing agreement or what buyer broker agreements they have already signed. So if they sign the touring agreement or the showing agreement with another agent in another part of the state, you can lock them into an exclusive for whatever area you want to. As I said, we're defaulting to the entire state. So if you want to default to the entire state, excluding the Florida Keys in this instance that you gave, no problem. You can do that. Buyers, I can tell you that taking a step back, I understand the intent of this settlement and whatnot, but I do believe it's going to create additional conflicts that were not contemplated and are simply going to come into play because now you're dealing with consumers versus broker to broker. And if there are conflicts, then that's where arbitration would pop in. So theoretically, you can have a buyer that is, please mute yourself. Whoever's unmuted, mute yourself. Okay, then I'll mute you. All right. If you could theoretically have a buyer that has obligated themselves to two agents, and that would come up with an arbitration or a commission dispute or whatnot, and depend on how much that brokerage wants to go after them. So you have to be careful about that. All right. All right. Line 3, what is the best generic terms to put in something like residential in Florida? Yes, we covered that. Any property commercial located in Florida? Yes. Okay, you are forcing it. Line 6, I have questions and buyer fee if VA. I will wait to send. Do you want to, Chris, do you want to unmute yourself and elaborate on VA buyers questions?
I will say Chris has another thing in the chat as well too. What if VA, will the buyer fee still be $9.95? What if it's a VA one? And then line number 6, what do you suggest for a retainer? And line number 9, what do you suggest for a termination fee?
Okay, great questions. All great questions. All right, so historically, our fee was reduced for VA buyers because they were coming. The VA limited what they could come out of pocket for. The VA has released that. They are no longer bound by $495 as their limitation on what they can pay and not being able to pay certain fees. So the VA has modified their terms, and it was earlier than the implementation of the NAR settlement. So it was before August 17th. I forget the exact deadline. I went over it at the sales meeting, but so yes, we are going across the board, same fee for everybody. It doesn't matter the type of buyer because we are not handcuffed anymore. So it is going to be a $9.95 fee for everyone. Retainer, non-refundable. Now, granted, with that said, you have the ability for VA buyers or any kind of buyers, you can use seller concessions. So in the FAQ, which I alluded to in the beginning, Joanna Watkins actually goes over this. Let me share my screen again. She goes over this. So there's an FAQ on here. Oh, actually, that's the one that I paid, that I played the little clip of. But the second one on this website here, the FAQ, she goes over all kinds of FAQs. One of the things she goes over is ordering the listings. So putting the listings in an order. You're not allowed to exclude listings based on compensation offered. However, you can order them. So just like you can order them in relation to area or sales price or whatever, you can order them on what's advantageous for this buyer based on their circumstance. So I want you to be very careful about that. But in the event that a buyer would need seller concessions for whatever reason, you can go find listings and show them the listings that have seller concessions first. All right. So that is a tool available to you. All right. Actually, let me keep the shared screen going because your question had to do with retainer fee. I think the next one had to do with a retainer fee. So let me show that up real quick. All right, buyer broker agreement, retainer fee. How much should you ask for a retainer fee? I think it is going to be case specific on what that buyer is asking you to do. If they are a dedicated buyer and you have a great relationship with them and you feel good that they are not going to try and go behind your back or whatever, or do a 7-day agreement and whatnot, then and run you around ragged for 7 days and then that's it, then then you might not want to charge a retainer fee. If you have someone who you don't feel good about, there is no loyalty whatsoever, and they're going to try and make you, submit 30 offers, and darn well those 30 offers are at 50% of the value, and they're likely not going to get accepted, then charge them whatever you think, $1,000, $5,000, $2,000, $3,000, whatever you think you can get out of it. I think it's going to be commensurate to whatever they are asking you to do. And so that's how I would address that. Now, even though the retainer is non-refundable and does not come off of the commission earned, the way this agreement is written, under paragraph 6, you could modify it under additional terms here under 13 other terms and say that in the event that we do close a transaction, then the retainer will be applied to the commission earned. So you can modify that if you want, but it defaults in your benefit to be able to do that. So, all right, and then I think the next question was about early termination fee, section 9. Once again, up to you. Cancellation fee. You can put in there whatever you feel comfortable putting in there, and it's going to be much like the retainer, depending upon what your feeling is about this this buyer and what's collectible. Because whatever is in this agreement, if you think about it, if they refuse to pay the agreement, what's agreed upon, we have to go after them through arbitration, hopefully, because that's what you got them to sign. But that still takes time and effort and potentially costs money if you have to pay the arbitrator or even mediator if you go to mediation for arbitration. But you have to, it's going to cost some money to do that and take some time. And even if you win, just so you know, even if you win in arbitration and they still don't pay, you still have to go get a judgment against them, which the arbitration agreement should automatically trigger a judgment. And then you still have to collect that. So it's not automatic that anything's going to be collected. That's why I made the comment of some conflicts are going to arise from this. And it's going to be dependent upon how much you want to push. We are here to support you in any way, shape, or form. I will guide you. I've been to court many times. I've been through mediations and arbitrations. I'm really not scared of anyone. So, but I will guide you and say, hey, we have a very good chance here. We don't have a very good chance here. Or I will defer you to an attorney. So just let you know that. So to answer your question, whatever you think you can put in there, you could just put something in there. And even if you're not going to enforce it, you could put something in there to help give it a little more teeth. So if you want to put $500 or $1,000 or whatever, just to give it a little more teeth, even if when push comes to shove, you may not decide to enforce it. So hopefully that helps. All right. What if we are the listing agent and get a call from an unrepresented consumer calling to see the home? Do we still need those agreements? So she went over that in the recording, and that has to do with, are you going to be representing them or not? So if you are showing them the home on behalf of the seller, or they're coming to see the home and tour the home on behalf of and you're just acting on the seller, then technically not. But there is a point when you're going to want to try and represent them. So you need to, I'd say earlier than later, get something, even get the touring agreement signed in that case. But if you can lock them into more, then lock them into a showing agreement or a exclusive. But technically the answer is no. I highly encourage you to try and get something. So they would have to be unrepresented on the contract. So if they want you to represent them on a contract, then fine. But if they're going unrepresented all the time, they have to submit a contract and on their own. So they have to do the whole thing. So anyway, yes, thank you, Marcus, for answering similar to what I answered. Can we do an IVR system in our phones and have commission information there? Elvin, I apologize for my ignorance on IVR. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like it means something like an automated system. And Andy has already said that yes, we can explore that. It sounds like an automated system of responding, either prompts or whatever.
Click one, go and hold, that kind of thing.
Maybe include the document as a link. Yeah, we have to be very careful about how this is worded. Marcus nailed it on how docs speak to commissions. So I believe we can probably upload something as an attachment as more information, go here, but I don't think we can say, hey, in order to see your commission, go here. So we'll have to be tread lightly with that. Okay, we talked about that. Will there be an app for this new website for commissions? No, but it will be interactive for we already have the website that we're going to use. It will be interactive for mobile devices. It's going to be on impactrealtyinfo.com. We're going to keep that site separate from impacttampa.com, which the reason we're doing that, there's a couple of reasons we're doing that. Number one, that site is more agent driven. So it's got more information about the brokerage, what we offer, blah, blah, blah. And that's where I want to drive other agents to. And the consumers go search for properties on the other site, which has IDXs, all kinds of different, it has a lot more bells and whistles to it versus the website that we've got is very, very simple. Now, I believe once it rolls out, Andy will be able to speak to this further, but it's really going to be a link that we can put anywhere. So we can put it on your business card, we can put it on a form, we can put it in a QR code that's on site there, put on a QR code that's hanging on the sign writer. There'll be lots of ways to get to that site. So will be a link to impact forms besides .loop? I cannot answer that question, and I probably would say that the answer is probably going to be no, but all impact forms are going to be in .loop. All forms will be available on Form Simplicity, but they will be blank. They will not be filled out. So I highly encourage using the forms or downloading the forms from .loop that are already filled out with some of the key elements that we went over here. If a buyer goes directly to the listing agent to purchase the property, does the seller pay the agent the agreed upon buyer compensation or only pays the listing agent commission? If a buyer goes directly to the listing agent, that I think question needs to be cleaned up a little bit, because if it's an unrepresented buyer, we just talked about that. If it is a represented buyer, then they're required to communicate with us. So that's going to be the negotiable amount or the negotiation that is already dictated by the listing agreement. It can be modified though. So there is forms in there to modify what happens based, or who pays who based on the negotiation. So just because they put a listing amount in the listing agreement, it's not set in stone, but it can be, but it is the starting point. That's what they're agreed upon in the beginning. But if the negotiation comes through, they could modify that. But to answer your question, does the seller pay the agent the agreed upon compensation or only pays listing? It's whatever is dictated in the listing agreement, unless it's modified. The website that you are testing and will have the percentage being offered in each listing, is it a website for impact or is it a national database? It will be open to the public. Now, the only question that we are contemplating right now is there going to be some field that's going to have to be filled out that is realtor specific? So, maybe they have to enter their name and brokerage or their license number or whatever in order to get the information. Or do we just say enter the address and get the information? Then literally anyone can do it. I'm torn on that right now. To be determined on that. Okay. How will we be able to route parties to the website? We talked about that. So just to clarify, routing parties to the website, we will have it out there in as many manners as possible. So I highly encourage at each listing to have an informational form. We will have an informational form that can be an attachment, but we have to be very careful on the MLS. Anyway. Okay, we talked about that. Is there something supposed to be on the screen? I think I did go over a whole document that I forgot to share my screen. So I apologize, John Cotner. I believe that was the sections of section 8 and 10. If I need to record that again, I will. A lot of information. Can we get one sheet that is referenced with the most imperative takeaways and action items? Yeah, we can work on that. You are allowed to charge any amount of fees you want. So the question was, oh, do you have to charge the certain amount instead of you can charge anyone any fees you want. We are pre-populating it to make it simple for you guys because I know a lot of you just roll with what we've got and it's ordinary course of business. If you're still in the mentor program, how is the brokerage going to feel if we reduce the commission percentage the buyer pays? I know the brokerage would 10% go down in theory. Yes. So, correct. If you're in the mentor program, you need to talk to your mentor if you're going to be reducing commission specifically down to the point where the mentor gets nothing, right? So there's situations where we've had that they said, hey, I'm not taking a commission at all for whatever reason, but that actually does affect the people helping you out. So you need to talk to your mentor. If you get buy off on that, then we're okay with it. But typically we say to not reduce it less than 1% because you're taking money out of other people's pockets when you do that. So get with your mentor if you're going to be reducing commissions, but you are allowed to do that. Leases. Clarification regarding showings for leases. Are they potential tenant obligated? By the same sort? Yes. So great question. Yes, you can get a retainer from a tenant searching for a lease. That's a great opportunity to get a retainer, is going after if someone's going to run you around showing lease properties, and historically lease compensation is very low. It's typically only a couple $100, $100, $200. It's not a lot of money. So this is a great opportunity for you to go after leases and get a retainer for doing that. Great opportunity there. Yes, the agreement does cover leases. I'm sorry if I was a little bit confusing on that. The settlement agreement doesn't cover leases and doesn't cover commercial, but the forms do. So the Hometowns Heroes has limitation on transaction fees, I believe, as well. So we'll get with our lenders on that, but they're going to have to modify as well. That'll be a to-do. I'll get with the lenders on that. Are these retainers to be part of any fees from impact or any splits? Is that percentage at 100%? Are we separated from commissions? And just so you guys know, anytime from a brokerage perspective, anytime we retain things or lease fees or anything that's not a traditional sale, even low sales, we don't take our $9.95 on those. We do those on an 80-20 split. So that's something that would go into the 80-20 split. So we're not trying to beat you guys up when you collect a $500 retainer. Can we have a class that goes over the new documents, examples of the documents given to us in the class? I think it's something additional training. Good point. We are having our power forums after the Monday and Tuesday after the sales meetings. So whatever those dates are, I think they're the 13th and, well, I don't know what dates they are, but the Monday and Tuesday after the sales meeting, it's the 12th and 13th. We will be having our power forums, which would be a great opportunity to go over examples and whatnot. I agree with you that additional conversations should be had about this. We talked about that. Could I add something like this as remarks under the MLS? Seller will consider qualified offers that include buyer concessions that can be used towards buyer's agent compensation. The answer is no. You may not add that to the MLS. So you can add to the MLS about buyer concessions. You cannot say can be used towards buyer's agent compensation or other expenses. Just leave out buyer's agent compensation altogether. Oh, thank you, Marcus, for responding to that. Starting August 10th, thank you. VAs can pay whatever is traditional. So VAs, yes, August 10th. If somebody finds a house they like and you didn't send it to them, can they just cancel your exclusive agreement and avoid paying you, even within the protection period? It's going, theoretically, yes, they could cancel your exclusive agreement if you didn't and pay the cancellation fee. If there's not a cancellation, or if there's a cancellation fee in there, or if there's not a cancellation fee in there, they theoretically could And your protection period would only cover properties that you did show them. So, or sending them is a gray area. So yes, you do. That's another reason you do want to get an exclusive agreement, not just a showing agreement, not just a touring agreement. You want the exclusive and try and bind them as much as you can so that they are not just canceling on you, or get a retainer up front. Okay. Yes. The 390, it's really 395, but is only on the listing side. So we've always done this. We have always taken 295 from the buyer's agent. That's why we have it in the listing agreement already pre-populated. We just increased that by $100. That's all. So it doesn't dip into your pocket. Are we still required to list on the MLS within 24 hours? Yes. Nothing has changed there. August 12th and 13th, high-level form RSVP. Okay, that's it. All right, we made it through all the questions. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, Kevin, a couple other questions that came in. Just for clarification, open house when you're not the seller's agent. So if you're doing an open house for somebody else, you're still okay to do because you're representing the seller, right?
Correct. You are still, even if you are not the listing agent, but you're doing an open house for the listing agent, whether it's an impact listing or even a third-party listing, then correct, you are representing the seller in those instances.
Right.
So depending on those conversations, how those go, you want to eventually get them to sign agreements, but you don't have to, as soon as they walk in the door, you don't have to attack them.
Another question was, if a seller selects 3% for buyer agent commission on the listing agreement, do we have to disclose that amount or can they negotiate? So I think this is more of a question. If you have a buyer agreement to get paid, can you amend that to get paid more? We know we can amend it to get paid less. Can you amend it to get paid more if your buyer agreement was 2% and the seller's offering 3%?
That's a sticky situation. Theoretically, no, you're not supposed to.
Okay.
To answer the original question, are you required to disclose it? Yes, you are required to disclose the amount that's offered. In fact, in the FAQ that we didn't watch, she does specifically go over the scenario where you are required to cooperate with other brokerages, which includes disclosing the cooperative compensation that's being offered.
I believe the question is in turn to how to negotiate on behalf of the seller to make sure, if the seller's...
You would have that agreement signed prior to touring. So that's the problem, is you're locked into the agreement prior to touring the house. So then they tour the house, they like it, they want to make an offer, they find out that the seller's offering more. You really should not be doing that. That's going to get some people in hot water by doing that. I'm not saying they can't get away with it, because you probably could, but I would highly discourage that, and it's going to create liability that I do not want to get into. So I would prefer to go high on the buyer broker agreement. If you're going down that path, I'd prefer to go high on the buyer broker agreement, disclose to them that whatever we get compensated from other parties will be reduced. You either agree to accept that, or you reduce. So, or you don't reduce and you go after the people. But I wouldn't adjust it upwards. That's going to get us into some trouble. Even though I think theoretically it could be done if you sign the agreement, but I don't like that idea.
So on this particular question, they were asking on behalf of the listing side. So they just were wanting to know if their seller was able to go up to 3%, but if they wanted to negotiate and do things of kind of maybe best practices for there, would they put 2% starting off and then knowing it could go up high? Would they just start with 3%?
So let me take a step back here. Is the question if the listing agent has a percentage can you ask the buyer's agent what their buyer broker agreement says? And if their buyer broker agreement says less than what you're offering, can they offer less? That's going that direction you are not supposed to do. And you as the buyer's agent are not in any way obligated to tell the listing agent what your buyer broker agreement says. So you do not have to disclose that information to the listing agent. Listing agent is required to disclose to the buyer's agent.
Okay.
I don't know if that, I got a little confused on the way the question was worded, but I want to make that point. So as a buyer's agent, get your agreement signed for whatever you're comfortable taking and go as high as you can, knowing that you can reduce it. If the seller's agent offers less, then you can offset what the amount that is in the agreement, or you can reduce it.
Okay, sounds good. I think that was the rest of the questions that I had on my end.
Okay. All right, a couple more came in. We have all these currently adjusted to match. Yes, everything that we went over is for the new rules. Can these broker to broker and seller to broker disclosures signed by seller be put in the MLS as attachments like the current disclosures? That is no, they cannot. You're a good point, because that would have the amount in there that's being disclosed, so that you cannot do that. Yes. Thank you. What doc do we need for our existing listings? They have not come out with that yet. So that has yet to be released. So we've got 6 days theoretically before they release those, or till the 17th till it actually goes into play. But 6 days they're going to be pulling these off the MLS. All right. So going forward, on August 6th, all compensation fields are going to be pulled off. So what kind of chaos is going to be created by that? On our listings, there might be some transition period where we're driving people to, as we disseminate the ways to get people get accustomed to going to our website, where we're just kind of pointing to the website. However, and if they call the office or whatnot, we're going to point them to the website. So maybe what we could say is, for more information that does not talk about compensation in any way, just say additional information, reach out to the office, or we can get our addendum up there with the website. But there's going to be some adjustments on our listings, but you guys need to be prepared that not all brokerages are going to be as prepared as we are. So therefore, when you are representing buyers, when that compensation gets pulled from the MLS, if before the 6th, I would go ahead and print off all the MLS sheets. After the 6th, when it gets pulled off the MLS, there's going to be a little bit of communication for other brokers that are just not as good as us. So therefore, be aware that you're going to need to have that communication with them. Hopefully they are diligent and respond quickly, or hopefully there's indicators, or hopefully they're coming up with ideas like we are. I don't know. We'll see. I want you guys to be aware of that. So there's going to be a little bit of a frustration period. We will control everything that we can control within our brokerage, and make it as easy as possible for you and the consumers and the other brokers out there. So, okay. Anything else? These docs be a template section in .loop. Yes, they are going to be in a .loop template section. Yes. Yes, you're going to have to on the other side. I can only control what the inbound inquiries. I can't control the outbound. So we'll do the best we can, but unfortunately. All right. Anything else, guys? Nope. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you guys for watching the videos. And I promise you, take this as an opportunity. This is a great opportunity to excel in the industry. I really think that those of us that are well prepared are going to thrive and flourish and actually take control of our commissions and get a little bit more money. And I think those of us that are not as prepared, those out there that are not as prepared are going to suffer. So, all right, thanks guys, I appreciate you. Keep going.